This is Research Like a Pro, episode 216, Joanna West Case Study, Part 1. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogist professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the authors of Research Like a Pro, a genealogist guide. With Robin Worthland, they also co-authored the companion volume, Research Like a Pro with DNA. Join Diana and Nicole as they discuss how to stay organized, make progress in their research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go! Hi everyone, welcome to Research Like a Pro.
Hi Nicole, how are you today?
I'm good, Mom. Having a good day, getting ready to talk about my case study with you.
I'm really excited to talk about that. I think it's always fun to work through a project and discuss all of your methodology and the steps that you took.
What's up with you?
Well, I'm back to working on client projects. After taking a week off last week, I was down at Brigham Young University's Education Week teaching 2 classes there. Education Week runs from Tuesday through Friday, and you teach every day. One of my classes was on the research process, and the other one was using DNA with genealogy. So I taught 4 presentations on each of those subjects throughout the week. So it was a lot of work getting ready, just getting all the slides and everything in order. These were topics that we've taught before, but it's a little bit different audience, and most of them are a little bit more beginners, so I had to really think about what level I was teaching. Especially with the DNA, I was really interested to see that many people were there because they just wanted to know how DNA could help with their genealogy, and most of them really had questions about which tests to take. So I thought that was interesting because, we have that figured out pretty well, and I was able to give lots of good advice and help, and so it was really a fun week.
Yeah, Education Week at BYU is really fun, and I'm sad that I didn't get to go with you, but it's so neat to be able to teach family history to people who are interested in learning all kinds of topics, and there's all different subjects available at that conference, so it's not just a family history one, but there always seems to be a lot of people that are interested in the family history track and come over to that one room where they have all the family history classes and kind of stay there all day.
That's right. And pretty much had the same group, every day. There were different people that would come in maybe for 1 or 2 days and then not come another day or two. I mean, you don't take roll or anything, so I would just start recognizing the same people. And there's so many classes to choose from that I totally get if somebody wanted to just come for a couple of the family history classes and then go hit something else.
Yeah. Speaking of DNA, I've been working with the DNA test results on Ancestry of a new test taker who shared his results with me, who's a cousin on my husband's side. And he's 1 generation closer than my father-in-law to the research subject. So it's really exciting. And I've been kind of sorting his matches and figuring out all of his different lines so that I can narrow down to the one line that I'm interested in. And it's exciting to find new relevant matches that are pointing to a hypothesized family for my research subject.
Oh yeah, as soon as something new comes in, that's what you want to do is just start looking, isn't it right? And we have a client project that has been really quite a conundrum, and it's trying to find a biological father, and just had the Y-DNA results come in and seeing that it was a match to our targeted test taker. So that was exciting, and we're excited to dig in and see if we can now make progress on this project. So yeah, it's really hard to keep yourself from just diving in immediately when new DNA comes in.
Right. A new piece of the puzzle.
Yes, and it's interesting how important it is to get more pieces of the DNA puzzle. Just one test taker seldom is enough to solve some of these really difficult cases. So adding more evidence is so important.
Yeah, and that's actually a lot of what we'll talk about today in my Joanna West case study. It just really was important to have a lot of test takers because the research question was so far back in time.
Yeah. All through the week last week, I kind of kept reiterating that point, the importance of coverage and, testing the right people. So good concepts. Well, before we get to talking about your case study, let's just do some quick announcements. Talking about our study groups for 2022, we're excited to be starting Research Like a Pro 8 in September, and registration is now closed for that. But registration for Research Like a Pro with DNA will begin in a few months. So just keep listening for when that will open. It's usually about December, and that course will start in February of 2023, and it will run through the spring. So you can be thinking now if you're ready to commit to really working on a DNA project. And we have our newsletter for coupons that you can join. And you might want to think about with the DNA study group if you'd like to be a peer group leader. And we have the application on our website. So we're excited to be starting a new study group and tackling one of our own projects.
Yes, we are. It's always fun. So, our listener spotlight today is from Kenneth, and I talked with him in the chat at Roots Tech during the virtual exhibit hall. He's a podcast listener, and I asked if he had any ideas for a podcast topic. So, here's what he said: maybe something on colonial American research or something specific to Georgia, North Carolina, or Virginia. I enjoy the case study ones, it helps to hear the strategies in practice. The last few episodes I listened to were about fan club research, which I'm going to attempt for the first time soon. Any strategies similar to that would be great. Also, a how-to or a case study on using DNA for brick walls from the late 1700s to the early 1800s would be nice. I'm having trouble with a few lines, and using DNA for people from that time period seems to be more difficult than for recent people. Most of the articles or videos on DNA are more focused on more recent generations. And how true is that? And I thought that was such a good comment to read for this case study because today we are talking about using DNA for a distant research question in the 17 and 1800s. So we'll talk about strategies for how to do that today.
Well, that is perfect. And I love the idea of talking more about colonial American research, especially with Georgia, North Carolina, or Virginia, because we both just took that course. And so we can have some episodes coming up with some of our tips for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you decided on what you're doing for the study group yet? Because some of your research is in that time period in Georgia and Virginia.
I am still considering working on the Dillard case, and I am thinking of maybe working on George W. Dillard and figuring out his line going back, maybe trying to find his siblings to see if maybe one of his siblings was the parent of Cynthia Dillard and Elijah Dillard, because I have the matches to Elijah Dillard, but no clues from him about who his father was. But they all kind of lead back to George W. Dillard just based on locality and time. So I'm considering that. I'm also considering my Klein research, which is kind of stuck in Missouri about mid-1800s. So I don't know. I'm still thinking a bit about what I want to do.
It's always hard to decide.
Yeah.
It's so fun to make progress within the study group on a line that you've always wanted to work on. So
it really is fun.
It's a good opportunity. All right. Well, let's get started on the case study. So some background on this. This all comes back to my husband's line. So I married into the Dyer family and was helping my husband with some family history research and realized that, that his third great grandfather, John Robert Dyer, that was kind of a brick wall, and the trees that had parents for him were pretty obviously incorrect. So I started working on that. And in the first DNA study group, I found some matches that actually went back to his wife's side of the family, Barsheba Tharp. So I kind of switched over to start working on that side since that was a little more obvious, and we didn't know her parents either. In the DNA study groups, I've kind of progressed from learning about John Robert Dyer to his wife, Barsheba Tharp. And in one of the study groups, I was able to find Barsheba Tharp was the daughter of Lewis Tharp, who lived in Hawkins County, Tennessee in the early 1800s. But Lewis Tharp had two wives, and I know I've talked about this before, and it wasn't clear based on the DNA matches. There were a lot of DNA matches descending from his second wife, Judy Vernon, with high amounts. And the first wife, Joanna West, we only had matches to one of her other children, Elizabeth Tharp Parrott, and the matches were kind of small. So in my mind, it was pretty clear, Judy Vernon must be Barsheba's mother. The matches are stronger. But as I continued to research, just had kind of a lot of red flags and some conflicts with Barsheba's birth date, and we didn't know when exactly she was born. The records were all over the place from 1813 to 1818. And so if she was born after the marriage to Judy Vernon, which was in 1817, she would have been Judy's daughter. But if she was born before that marriage, she would have been Joanna West's daughter. So my original hypothesis that she was Judy's daughter, but then it just didn't really feel right, and I couldn't find any matches to any Vernons. So then I kind of switched over and to the hypothesis that it must be that Joanna West was the mother of Barsheba Tharp. And as I went down that path, I did start finding matches that came down from that other side, the west side of the family. And so that's when I decided to really dig into this hypothesis in the Research Like a Pro with DNA number 4 study group. So the objective that I came to for the study group was this. Was Joanna West the biological mother of Barsheba Tharp Dyer? Barsheba was the wife of John Robert Dyer, and they resided in Hawkins County, Tennessee from 1830 to 1880. Barsheba was born about 1813 to 1818 in Hawkins County, Tennessee, and was the daughter of Lewis Tharp. Lewis was born 1786 in Fauquier County, Virginia. Lewis was married twice, first to Joanna West in 1805 in Fauquier, Virginia, and second to Judy Vernon in 1817 in Hawkins County, Tennessee.
That's a great objective. You did all the right things with giving us some specific names and dates and places, and then also really identifying what you want to find out, which is testing that hypothesis that Joanna West was the biological mother of Barsheba. So I think that's so important in DNA work rather than saying who is the mother, which, you'd already done a couple of projects working on that one, but now that you've got the hypothesis, now this one can go forward either proving or disproving that. So I just wanted to make a comment or maybe pose a question that you were getting matches from both of the wives, and so obviously only one of them can be the mother. So those DNA matches are probably inheriting, for the one that isn't the mother, inheriting the segments that are actually coming from the father.
Right. Yes, because, he was married twice. And so I didn't know which one was the mother. And so the relationships to the descendants of one of the wives is going to be half fourth cousins. And then to the other wife would be full fourth cousins. And so I thought the amounts of shared DNA would be able to show that by one being higher and the other being lower. But what I actually think happened is the second wife was younger, her children were born later, and there's fewer generations. So some of them are like half third cousins once removed and a little bit closer. Also, Lewis Tharp and his second wife had a lot more children. And so there's just a lot more matches and a lot more of an opportunity for those matches to have inherited the same segments that Barsheba's descendants inherited from Lewis Tharp. So even though those matches were higher, it was just because there were more of them, and some of them were low and some were high. So it was kind of confusing to figure out. But what eventually helped me come to the hypothesis that Joanna West was the mother was the matches going back further generations to Joanna's parents and grandparents and great-grandparents.
Right, and that's what you always want to look for, going back to the next generation, and that's how you determine which wife somebody descended through. That it's such a simple thing, but yet unless it's pointed out or you stumble upon that idea for yourself, you may be missing that.
Well, and the obvious idea to do it first was to test the mitochondrial DNA. And so I did that, and I had a test taker from Barsheba, and then I found another test taker, but they didn't test. And so I kind of turned toward this other hypothesis that could be analyzed in the autosomal DNA. And while I still want to do the mitochondrial testing, I wanted to make sure that I was using the evidence I already had from all the autosomal test takers that I have, because it's already there. It's still in my plan to do the mitochondrial testing, but this was a project to review what I already had in autosomal testing.
Yeah, I think that's a great methodology.
So I mentioned, Joanna West and her parents and grandparents and stuff. I had found out about this research from just reviewing what was out there in family trees, and I stumbled upon a researcher named Mike, who I got in contact with, who was descended from Joanna West's father, John West. And he had done a ton of research in land and probate records for the West family. We already knew Joanna was the daughter of John West from her marriage record to Lewis Tharp, where John West gave permission. And Mike had figured out that Joanna's father, John West, was married twice. And first, he was married to Bathsheba Arnold, and second, he was married to Sally Webb. And Mike was a descendant through the second wife, Sally Webb. And he had done a lot of research to figure out more about John West. He wanted to know John West's parents. So he had traced John West back in time to Fauquier County, Virginia, which is also where Lewis Tharp came from. They were associates and had moved to Hawkins County seemingly together. And so Mike had found a lot of evidence connecting John West to his first wife, Bathsheba, and her parents, Humphrey Arnold and Anne Arnold. And some people in trees call her Harriet Ann Smith. But in the records, I was only able to find that it listed Humphrey Arnold and his wife Anne. So I don't know where the Harriet Smith part came from, but that's in the trees. But anyways, Mike had found a bunch of documents, land records mostly. He had, done some land platting and found that they lived near each other and that Humphrey Arnold had bequeathed land to John West and his wife Bathsheba. So he had kind of pieced it all together already. So this was really helpful because I now had this line that I could check against to see if there's DNA matches coming down from John West and Bathsheba and also coming down from Humphrey Arnold and Anne, and to see if, those matches were connected to descendants of Barsheba Tharp Dyer to test the hypothesis.
Yeah, that is great. I love to hear about that collaboration with Mike, who had done so much work on the West. And as you were talking, I was thinking about the importance of this documentary research portion of the project because, you might think that when you go that far back, you just need to rely on DNA. But of course, that's never correct. We always have to dig into the documents and make sure things make sense in the documentary evidence. So this is such a good example of that.
Yeah, the documentary evidence really was very clear, and it was a helpful guide to have that because sometimes at this time period, there isn't clear documentary evidence linking the generations. And so it becomes very muddled, and you can't really use the DNA unless you have clear evidence of parent-child relationships. So there's other cases I've worked on where I just wasn't able to make a lot of progress because of that lack of documents.
Right. So you've got your objective. What is the next step that you did?
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to work on coming into the study group. And then the first step of the study group, week 1, is about clustering the DNA matches, assessing the matches, doing pedigree analysis, and kind of, a step for people who maybe don't know what they want to work on to figure out some different objectives. So what I decided to work on, since I already kind of knew my focus, I decided to work on making a new clustering, a network graph for a different descendant of Barsheba Tharp Dyer. And the one that I chose was through her daughter, Elizabeth Frances Dyer. And I had seen that she had shared a lot of DNA with this side of the family, with Joanna West's other daughter, Elizabeth Tharp Parrott. And so I thought maybe she would have a stronger connection to the Joanna West side. So I decided to make a network graph using Gephi, an open source program to cluster DNA matches using the downloaded spreadsheets from DNA GEDCOM client. Using that software, I downloaded the matches from Ancestry and the shared matches. So I had 2 spreadsheets, the list of matches and the list of in common with or shared matches. And then you import those into the Gephi network graph program, and then you can make a cluster network graph. And when I did that, I was able to pull out just clusters that were relevant to the project. So I focused on the paternal clusters that were connected to the Dyers and the Tharps. And so when I just selected those clusters, then I set the graph to recluster and I laid it out again to pull apart those clusters into smaller groupings and ran the modularity again, which gave me more clusters. Then this helped me to find a group of matches who were descendants of Barsheba Tharp Dyer. And so those are my base test takers who I've proven are relevant descendants of Barsheba. Then I found a connected group of matches who were descendants of Lewis Tharp and Joanna West's daughter, Elizabeth Tharp Parrott. And then another cluster, a really big one, that appeared to be people who all descended from Humphrey Arnold and Harriet Ann Smith of Fauquier County, Virginia. And so they all have that name, those names in their tree. And this was exciting to see, so many matches who seem to be descendants of the hypothesized great grandparents of Barsheba Tharp Dyer.
Wow, that is exciting. And they must have had a large family as well, or just had a lot of people test.
Yes, they had a large family. They had a bunch of children, and those children had a lot of children.
That's really helpful when you're working that far back. So these would be matches that I would assume did not share a lot of DNA. These would be smaller matches because they're so far back from your test taker.
Yeah, you're right. And I tried to focus on those that shared, more than 15 centimorgans. And using a network graph, the lower your threshold is, the messier the graph gets. So the threshold I think I was working with was 15 centimorgans. So I didn't have all the matches in there that were smaller than that. And so that helped me to focus on matches that were probably not false matches. Yeah, so I would say they were sharing 15 centimorgans up to 40 centimorgans about there.
Did a lot of those matches have trees? I'm guessing that they had trees, so that's how you could easily identify that cluster.
Yeah, in this first week of the study group, I was just focusing on ones that had really big, obvious trees. So I think at that time I found like 3 or 4 matches in the cluster whose trees were going back to the Humphrey Arnold and Harriet Ann Smith couple. And what's exciting is when you can find 3 or 4 from a cluster who go back, you can hypothesize that all the rest of the people in that cluster are probably also descendants of that couple or along that line.
That's really great. Well, and another way I have found matches going to a hypothesis is using through lines and, connecting your tree to a hypothesis and then seeing if you get some through line matches. But you have to also analyze, but that's another method for finding some matches too. People that go far back that have trees.
Absolutely. It's a good clue. And that's another way to find matches who are smaller than can be on a network graph too. It's just important to check their shared matches and make sure they're in the right genetic network and stuff.
Just one of the advantages, I think, to Gephi, because you see those clusters form pretty clearly, and then you can also see connections to other clusters, which you don't see in through lines. You only get the people in one group. You don't see how they might be connected other ways as well. So
right, through lines doesn't look at shared matches at all. And sometimes, I've found through lines that just has people from all different clusters and just really small matches. They're all incorrect. But often they are correct. And so you just have to review it just like any other authored source.
Right.
Okay, with the second week, the purpose of that lesson was to review your objective if you haven't created one yet and see if your research objective is viable, what the limitations of it will be, and make a lucid chart or a diagram showing the descendants of your research subject. So, with my objective, I did have a pretty big limitation, which was that I was using autosomal DNA and the objective was pretty distant in time. However, I had identified over 10 test takers who were descendants of Barsheba Tharp Dyer, and I was able to identify relevant autosomal DNA matches in several of those base test takers' results. So I was feeling pretty confident that this objective was going to be possible to find, evidence that would help support it and that wouldn't be a waste of time. Then I charted the matches descending from Barsheba Tharp's mother's side using lucid charts. Since I had matches coming from several different ancestral couples that were helping provide evidence that Joanna West was the mother of Barsheba, I used color to show the different lines of descent. So I had all the matches who were descendants of Barsheba as one color, and then all the matches who were descendants of Joanna West, another color, and then matches descending from John West were another color. And since he had 2 wives, I put all the matches for one wife on the left, the matches for the other wife on the right, but I kept them all the same color for that generation. And then going back to Bathsheba Arnold's parents, Humphrey Arnold and Harriet Ann Smith, that's where I had the most matches, and those were all in red. And so I had a bunch of matches from that line. So being able to see all of these groups by color kind of helped me see where I was missing some people. I really needed to find more matches from John West and his 2 wives. And so I kind of made that a goal for my research plan because I had Humphrey Arnold, that generation, but I thought it would add stronger evidence to my case to find several matches from each of these generations.
And how could you ever keep all this straight if you didn't have it drawn out in your Lusa chart?
Right?
It would be so confusing.
It's really true.
I was teaching this step last week during Education Week and mentioned that you can use a program like LusaChart or diagrams.net, which are both, very, very similar, or you can just use sticky notes on a whiteboard or paper and pencil. We like doing the digital diagrams because we can obviously move them around and change them and don't have to redraw things. But often when I have something I'm trying to figure out and I don't want to open up my computer, I'll just sit and jot down on paper the connections and try to figure out something, a little bit more simple. But for these complicated cases, oh my word, you really have to have a good diagram going.
Yeah, and I even needed to refer back to my pedigree chart all the time because I have Barsheba Tharp Dyer, then the next generation is Joanna West and Lewis Tharp, and then the next generation is John West and Bathsheba Arnold, and then the next generation is Humphrey Arnold and Anne. And so I had all these generations to keep track of too. So I needed multiple charts to help me keep everything straight.
Yeah. And after you've worked with the family for a while, you do kind of start to get them in their right place, but it can take a while before you can visualize without looking at the pedigree chart where everybody is, what generation they're in, especially when you have those names that are similar, like Barsheba, 2 Barshebas.
Which was amazing because that was really, I felt, strong evidence for this being the correct family. Joanna named her daughter after her mother.
Right. We always want to look at naming patterns, especially during this time, because they are prevalent.
Exactly. Well, the next week was about gathering everything you already have into a timeline to organize it, making citations for that, and file organization. So this was something that really helped me because I had kind of, done some off and on research. Mike had sent me a lot of research, and I really needed to get it organized to see what I had and what was missing so that I could make my research plan. So I worked on making folders, in my file organization with each surname. So I had folders for Dyer, Tharp, West, Arnold, and Smith. And I added the people who I was working on within those folders. And then in Airtable, I worked on making the timeline. And I already had a lot of information from my previous work on Barsheba Tharp's father, Lewis Tharp. I had documentation for his marriage to Joanna West. I had Joanna's father, John West. So I added those things to my timeline from my previous work. And then, so I was just kind of copying, pasting things in. And then I added in a lot of the things that Mike had, which were derivative records that he had sent me. And so I was putting in okay, there's a land record and there's a will, but he hadn't sent me the originals. So I was just putting in the derivatives. Because I had already done a lot of work on Lewis Tharp and Joanna West, this timeline was focused more on John West and Bathsheba Arnold, and then Bathsheba's parents, Humphrey Arnold and Anne. So that was mostly what was in the timeline, was kind of the details that I had gathered about them. And so that was a helpful step to really getting organized and seeing what I had.
So for your timeline, did you do a completely new timeline, or did you just add them to your existing timeline and then use the grouping feature of Airtable to view just the records for John and Bathsheba? Or how did you do that?
I started a new one and copied and pasted in a few things that were relevant, but mostly I was just starting a new one with information from Mike about John West and his wife, Bathsheba Arnold, and then Bathsheba's parents. So I did add in the names of the people so I could group it because there were 3 generations here. That was really helpful to being able to see what I had on each generation.
So because this was a whole new objective, did you just start a whole new Airtable?
Yep. What I usually do with that is I just start a new one and then I can copy and paste over any relevant things I want to use. The other Airtable base that I had was focused on Lewis Tharp and the Tharp side. So I didn't want to use that one.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it is really nice that you can just take some of those relevant things from the timeline and just easily copy and paste them into the new Airtable. But when you do your Airtables by objectives, it makes sense to start something new.
Also, it helps to think about the evidence you have for this research question because you already have seen this information and it helped with a different objective. But now, how does it apply to this question? And what evidence does it provide about Barsheba being the daughter of Joanna West? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. You're looking at things with a different focus.
Mm-hmm.
That makes a difference.
Yep. So for week 4, this lesson was about analyzing your sources and your DNA matches. So during this assignment, I worked on analyzing a lot of matches, and I had added a bunch of matches to my Airtable base that I hadn't added in Lucidchart yet. So I updated my Lucidchart diagram and put all the people in there and really made my diagram good and analyzed the amounts of shared DNA with the relationships. And that wasn't too hard because the relationships are all like fifth cousin and they were all sharing about 30 centimorgans or less. So it was pretty straightforward as far as, okay, yep, this fits and could be true. And just got a lot of ideas for my research plan for what I would need to do.
Isn't it nice to just have this be one step at a time to focus on? You know,
Yeah.
it just really makes you take your time and just realize you don't have to do this project all at once. Just do this step. And then next week we're going to do another step. You know, it's what I love about the study group and having this process down.
Right. And then the next 3 weeks were about locality and ethnicity and exploring DNA tools. So, week 5, I looked at the ethnicity of a lot of my base test takers, and I noticed that some of them had the early Virginia settlers community, including the descendant that I made the network graph of, who was through Barsheba's daughter, Elizabeth Frances Dyer. And so some of them had inherited a lot of segments from this Fauquier County group that settled in Fauquier County, Virginia. And other of the test takers didn't have that community. And so it just kind of showed how recombination makes some ancestors come through stronger and others not at all. And then in week 6, it was to explore genetic network tools. So I played with Gephi and worked on a network graph for a different descendant of Barsheba Tharp Dyer. Playing with the modularity setting, I had watched a video on YouTube about Gephi from David Vance, and he talked about, if you would put the modularity up higher, it gives you less clusters. And if you have the modularity be lower, like 1, then you get more clusters. And so I wanted to see if that played out. So I adjusted the modularity to 5, and then I got 9 clusters. And one of the clusters was like one whole half of the network graph, and it was the whole paternal side. And then the maternal side had been broken down into 8 other clusters. And then I tried again to run modularity with the number 1, and that gave me 28 clusters. And so I thought that was interesting to see how you can adjust the settings and it kind of work on walking the clusters back. And you can see, like, with if it just breaks it down into 2, then you get a maternal side and a paternal side. And then if you lower the modularity a little at a time, you get clusters for each of the 4 grandparent sides. And then lower the modularity down even more, you get more smaller cluster groups representing more distant ancestors. So that was fun. I didn't find that this test taker had a lot of matches relevant to the project, but I did enjoy playing with Gephi. And then week 7 was segment tools. And so I ended up using the auto segment report from Genetic Affairs on Family Tree DNA. And I found a relevant person, a match who descended from Joanna West's other daughter, Elizabeth Tharp Parrott. And so that was really helpful to paint her to my DNA painter profile for my father-in-law, and was happy to use this match to find more descendants of Joanna West to include in the project.
Let's go back to, Gephi for just a minute. Well, you explained what happened when you adjusted the modularity, but I think it might be helpful if you just kind of define modularity.
So when you run modularity, that's how Gephi uses an algorithm to look at how many people are connected to each other and separate them into clusters or groups of people who are communities. And I kind of researched the algorithm that was used, and I don't remember the name of it, but Gephi uses a particular algorithm for their modularity. And then basically it looks at how many connections, how tightly related are these groups. So you can change the settings for that to look for looser groups. And I think that's what happens when you adjust the modularity to be higher. And so it includes more and more people. And then if you put the modularity lower, it's breaking it down into smaller communities that are more tightly related. And I'm not sure if I'm explaining that right, but that's kind of how I...
Yeah. It's just helpful to know a little bit about how a tool is working.
Yeah, I wish I really understood it more, but it was very mathematical and focused. It was very like you need a background in I don't know, statistics or something.
And we're just grateful that there are people that have built tools like this
Yeah.
and where we don't have to understand it all to use it. It's the same way with all the DNA testing companies. We don't need to understand their algorithms. They don't really reveal their algorithms. We just are happy that we get some results to work with.
Knowing a little bit of how it works can help you analyze the information you're seeing, right? Like with MyHeritage, knowing that they use imputation for their DNA matches can help you understand why sometimes there's errors, because sometimes they're guessing what SNPs would be there because they're taking tests from different companies that tested different SNPs. So it is helpful to learn as much as we can about how the algorithms work. But at the same time, you're right. We don't have to be experts at it and know everything to be able to use the evidence.
Right. So what else are we going to talk about with your project?
Well, for this episode, let's end with research planning. So week 8 of the study group was to create a research plan. And now that I had reviewed, all the information from a timeline, I had explored some different tools to see if they would be helpful. And I was able to kind of put together everything into a plan. And so for my plan, I decided to find the original deeds and wills for John West and Humphrey Arnold. Then I also wanted to work on finding evidence for parent-child links for Humphrey Arnold to all of his children. Since I had so many DNA matches to all of his children, I wanted to make sure that those children were accurately placed in his family. And so I focused on looking in Fauquier County, Virginia, marriage bonds, and also published genealogies and trees related to that family to see what evidence they had already found, and then just kind of go forward from there. And then as far as finding more relevant DNA matches, my goal was to use the network graph that I had made for the descendant of Elizabeth Frances Dyer. Just working on pedigree triangulation for that cluster I had identified that had so many matches in it, and try to find a lot of matches for Humphrey Arnold's descendants and also hopefully for John West's descendants too, since I realized I was lacking in that generation. So that was kind of my research plan. It wasn't too big. It was just really focused on finding original records from those derivatives and then finding more matches and verifying parent-child links for that first generation of Humphrey Arnold's children.
Right, and I think that that's a good description of it, that it wasn't too complicated. You didn't plan to use a bunch of different DNA tools. You were just working within your network graph and checking the evidence there. There was so much to work with there. So, with the DNA study group, we just recommend that people choose 2 or 3 things for documentary, 2 or 3 things for DNA. Keep it simple and just really work through your plan. That keeps you from getting overwhelmed with your research.
Yes, and really what it comes down to with DNA evidence is being able to prove parent-child links and finding people who are in the same cluster going back to your hypothesized parents. So
Right.
once you can get to that point of finding those matches, and you're just doing a lot of reviewing trees and then looking for documentary evidence.
Right. Well, thanks for walking us through all of the steps that you've been taking so far in this project. It's just fun to break it down and hear how you tackled each one. So I'm excited to talk next time about what you actually found, some of your conclusions.
Yeah, next time we'll go through my findings and the report and talking about the evidence that led me to the conclusion that I came to. So that'll be fun.
All right. Well, everyone have a great week, and we will talk to you next time.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our books, Research Like a Pro and Research Like a Pro with DNA on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our online courses or study groups of the same names. Learn more at familylocket.com/services. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our courses. To get updates in your email inbox each Monday, subscribe to our newsletter at familylocket.com/newsletter. Please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. We read each review and are so thankful for them. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.